Dr. Amara Chen thought precision could solve everything until her brother's gambling debt dragged her into a world where scalpels meant nothing and Korean syndicate bosses held the power of life and death. She was about to discover that some debts could only be paid in blood and loyalty. At 28, Amara had built her life around control and excellence. She was the youngest cardiac surgeon at Metropolitan General Hospital, known for her steady hands and unshakable focus during the most complex procedures. Her natural hair was pulled back in a sleek bun that never moved during 18-hour surgeries, and her dark eyes held the kind of intensity that made residents snap to attention. She had fought for every achievement, from her full scholarship to Harvard Medical School to her coveted position in one of the country's most prestigious cardiac departments. Saving lives was more than her profession. It was her calling, and she approached each patient with the same methodical precision that had carried her through years of being the only black woman in operating rooms full of skeptical colleagues. The call came at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, while she was reviewing patient charts in her office. Amara recognized her brother's number immediately, but something in the way her phone buzzed twice before she could answer made her stomach clench with dread. Marcus Chin's voice shook when she finally picked up. "I need you to come home right now," he said, and she could hear him trying to control his breathing. "Please, Amara. I messed up. I messed up really bad." Amara set down her pen and closed the patient file in front of her. Marcus was 3 years younger than her, charming and intelligent, but prone to making decisions with his heart instead of his head. She had been bailing him out of minor troubles since their grandmother raised them both after their parents died in a car accident when Amara was 16. But there was something different in his voice tonight, a note of genuine terror that made her forget about her early morning surgery schedule. "What happened?" she asked, already reaching for her car keys. "Just come home," Marcus repeated. "I can't explain this over the phone. But Amara, they know where we live. They know about grandmother's house." The drive from downtown to the modest neighborhood where their grandmother's house sat took 25 minutes through empty streets. Amara's mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. Marcus had been working as a financial analyst at a small firm, living quietly in the house they had inherited, taking care of their grandmother's medical bills and maintaining the property. He wasn't the type to get involved with dangerous people, but the fear in his voice suggested exactly that kind of trouble. The house looked normal from the outside, warm lights spilling from the front windows, the small garden their grandmother had loved still carefully maintained. But when Marcus opened the front door before she could knock, Amara saw that his hands were visibly shaking and his usually immaculate appearance was disheveled. His dress shirt was wrinkled, his tie loose, and there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't slept in days. "They're going to take the house," he said without preamble, closing the door behind her and checking the locks twice. "They're going to take everything, and if I can't pay them back, they're going to kill me." Marcus led her to their grandmother's old kitchen, where manila folders and legal documents were spread across the worn wooden table. Amara recognized some of the paperwork, property deeds and mortgage information, but there were other documents written in what looked like Korean characters alongside official-looking contracts with numbers that made her blood run cold. Marcus sat down heavily in one of the chairs and put his head in his hands. "I started gambling online about 6 months ago," he began, his voice muffled. "Just small amounts at first, poker games, sports betting. I was actually winning for a while. But then I lost a big hand, and I thought I could make it back quickly." Amara felt her heart sinking as the familiar pattern became clear. She had seen gambling addiction destroy families during her medical training, had watched brilliant people make increasingly desperate choices chasing losses that only grew larger. But she had never imagined her careful, responsible brother falling into the same trap. Marcus continued without looking up. "I found this high-stakes underground game through a contact at work. Korean guys, very organized, very professional. They said I could play on credit since I had good references. The first few nights went well, and I thought I had found something that could really change our financial situation." "How much?" Amara asked, though she dreaded the answer. Marcus finally raised his head, and she saw that his eyes were red with exhaustion and fear. $2 million, he whispered. "I put up the house as collateral for a loan to cover my losses, thinking I could win it back in one good night. Instead, I lost everything." The number hit Amara like a physical blow. $2 million was more money than she made in 3 years, more than the house was worth, more than either of them could ever hope to repay through legitimate means. She stared at the documents spread across the table, seeing their grandmother's carefully preserved home transformed into numbers on contracts she couldn't read. Marcus reached into one of the folders and pulled out a photograph that made Amara's stomach turn. It showed a man's hands, or what was left of them, mangled and bloody beyond recognition. There were other photos underneath, each more disturbing than the last, documenting what happened to people who failed to honor their debts to the Jiang family organization. They don't negotiate, Marcus said quietly. They don't do payment plans or extensions. You pay in full by the deadline, or you disappear. They gave me 1 week to come up with the money, and that was 4 days ago. Amara picked up one of the contracts, trying to make sense of the legal language mixed with Korean text. The signature at the bottom was bold and confident, written in English letters that spelled out Jang Hyunwoo. Even written on paper, the name seemed to carry weight and authority. There has to be something we can do, she said, though her voice lacked conviction. I can talk to the bank about extending my credit line, maybe take out loans against my practice. Marcus shook his head. I already tried everything. Banks won't loan this amount without years of approval processes, and we have 3 days. I talked to lawyers, financial advisors, even tried to contact private investors. No legitimate source can move this kind of money quickly enough. Amara stared at the photographs again, understanding finally settling over her like a cold weight. Her brother hadn't called her for advice or comfort. He had called her to say goodbye, to warn her that the house they had grown up in was about to be lost along with his life. There was no magical solution waiting in her medical expertise, no surgical precision that could cut away this problem and leave healthy tissue behind. The rational part of her mind, the part trained to remain calm during medical crises, began calculating options. She could liquidate her savings and retirement accounts, cash in her life insurance policy, sell her car and medical equipment. But even combining everything she owned, she would barely reach $100,000. The gap between what she could provide and what Marcus owed was insurmountable through legal means. As if reading her thoughts, Marcus pulled out one more document from the folder. This one was printed in English, with a header that made Amara's heart skip. It was a detailed background report on Dr. Amara Chun, including her medical credentials, income history, and personal information that no stranger should have access to. Someone had been researching her thoroughly, and the implications of that research were becoming terrifyingly clear. They know about you, Marcus said quietly. They know you're successful, that you have skills they might find valuable. When I told them I couldn't pay, they asked about family members who might be able to help with the debt. Amara felt the world shifting around her as she realized this conversation was heading somewhere she couldn't follow. The careful life she had built, the sterile safety of operating rooms and medical conferences, suddenly seemed incredibly fragile. She was a surgeon, trained to save lives within the controlled environment of a hospital. She had no idea how to navigate the world her brother had stumbled into, where debts were collected in blood and mercy was a luxury nobody could afford. The two of them sat in their grandmother's kitchen until dawn, surrounded by documents that spelled out an impossible situation. By the time the first morning light filtered through the windows, Amara understood that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't predict or control. The only question remaining was whether that change would destroy everything she had worked to build, or whether she could find a way to save her brother without losing herself in the process. Marcus fell asleep in his chair as the sun rose, exhaustion finally overcoming his fear. Amara sat watching him, thinking about the photographs of mutilated hands and the name written with such confidence at the bottom of legal documents. Jang Hyunwoo. She repeated the name silently, trying to imagine the kind of man who could inspire such terror while running an organization sophisticated enough to conduct detailed background research on potential assets. In less than 72 hours, she would meet that man face to face, and her life would never be the same. The emergency call came at 9:15 on Friday night, dragging Amara from a medical journal she had been reading to distract herself from thoughts of Marcus and impossible debts. Mass casualty event, the dispatcher said, multiple trauma victims requiring immediate surgical intervention at an industrial location downtown. All available trauma surgeons were being mobilized to provide on-site emergency care, before transport to area hospitals. Amara grabbed her emergency medical kit and raced to Metropolitan General's ambulance bay, where paramedics were already loading equipment for what appeared to be a significant incident. The ride through the city took 12 minutes, sirens wailing as they navigated traffic toward a warehouse district she had never visited before. Through the ambulance windows, she could see other emergency vehicles converging on the same location, their red and blue lights painting the industrial buildings in flashing colors. The warehouse exterior looked ordinary enough, a nondescript building with no signage or identifying markers. But as soon as Amara stepped out of the ambulance, she sensed something unusual about the scene. There were too many expensive cars parked in the shadows between buildings, sleek imports and luxury sedans that seemed out of place in this industrial neighborhood. Men in dark suits stood in small groups, speaking in low voices and watching the emergency responders with expressions that mixed concern with barely concealed hostility. Inside the warehouse, Amara discovered why the dispatch had called for multiple trauma surgeons. The building had been converted into an elaborate fighting arena, with a raised platform surrounded by tiered seating that could accommodate several hundred spectators. Medical equipment had been hastily arranged in one corner, creating a makeshift field hospital where paramedics were already working on victims with injuries ranging from severe lacerations to what appeared to be internal bleeding. The scale of violence was unlike anything Amara had encountered during her hospital rotations or emergency room shifts. These weren't random accident victims or typical assault cases. The injuries were systematic and brutal, inflicted by people who understood human anatomy well enough to cause maximum damage without necessarily killing their targets immediately. She counted at least 8 men requiring immediate surgical intervention, with several more nursing injuries that would need treatment once the critical cases were stabilized. Amara moved efficiently between patients, triaging injuries and determining which victims needed immediate attention to survive the next hour. Her hands moved with practiced precision as she examined wounds and administered emergency treatment, falling into the familiar rhythm of crisis medicine that had sustained her through years of training. The warehouse setting was far from ideal, but she had learned to adapt surgical techniques to challenging environments during her residency at an urban trauma center. As she worked to stabilize a man with multiple stab wounds to his torso, Amara became aware of a presence watching her from across the makeshift medical area. She looked up to see a Korean man in his mid-30s, impeccably dressed despite the blood that stained his expensive suit jacket. His face was sharp and controlled, with dark eyes that missed nothing as he observed her technique. Even injured, he commanded obvious respect from the other men in the warehouse, who deferred to his presence despite his need for medical attention. The man approached slowly, moving with careful precision that suggested his injuries were more serious than his composed demeanor indicated. Blood seeped through his white dress shirt from what appeared to be a knife wound near his left shoulder, but his attention remained focused entirely on Amara's work rather than his own condition. "You are very skilled," he said, his English perfect despite a subtle accent that confirmed his Korean heritage. "More skilled than I expected from emergency response personnel." Amara glanced up from her patient long enough to assess the stranger's injuries. "You need immediate attention for that shoulder wound," she said, her voice maintaining the professional tone she used with all patients regardless of circumstances. "The bleeding suggests arterial involvement that could become life-threatening without proper treatment." The man smiled slightly, an expression that seemed both appreciative and calculating. "I will wait until my people are cared for first," he said. "Their needs take priority over my own comfort." "That is not how medical triage works," Amara replied firmly, finishing her current patient's emergency stabilization. "Severity of injury determines treatment order, not personal hierarchies. Your shoulder requires immediate surgical attention." The man studied her face with renewed interest, as if her professional insistence had revealed something unexpected about her character. Around them, other medical personnel continued working on victims, while men in expensive suits maintained watchful positions throughout the warehouse. The entire scene felt surreal, like a medical emergency happening inside someone else's dangerous world. "Dr. Chun," the man said suddenly, and Amara felt her blood turn cold as he spoke her name with complete confidence. "Dr. Amara Chun from Metropolitan General Hospital, cardiac surgery specialist, graduated Harvard Medical School with highest honors. Amara's hands stilled on her medical equipment as the full implications of his knowledge settled over her. She had been so focused on the medical crisis that she hadn't considered why emergency responders had been called to what was obviously an illegal fighting operation, or how someone running such an organization might have prepared for exactly this type of incident. "You know who I am," she said, her voice carefully controlled despite the fear growing in her chest. "I make it my business to know useful people," the man replied. "My name is Jang Hyunwoo, and I believe you have been looking for a way to contact me regarding your brother's financial obligations." The warehouse seemed to grow quieter around them as Amara processed what she was hearing. This was the man whose signature had appeared on Marcus's debt documents, the person whose organization had researched her background so thoroughly. The coincidence of being called to treat his injured associates was no coincidence at all, she realized. This meeting had been arranged deliberately, designed to showcase her medical skills while demonstrating his power and reach. "I did not arrange to be here tonight," Amara said carefully, unsure whether honesty or denial would serve her better in this situation. Jang Hyunwoo nodded slightly, acknowledging her statement without necessarily accepting it as complete truth. "Emergency response protocols are surprisingly easy to influence when you have the right connections," he said. "I needed to observe your capabilities personally before making any decisions about your brother's situation." Amara looked around the warehouse, understanding finally dawning as she recognized the calculated nature of everything happening around her. The fighting tournament, the deliberately inflicted injuries, the emergency call that had brought her directly to this location. It was all a test designed to evaluate her medical skills under pressure while placing her in a position where she would need to interact with Jang Hyunwoo directly. "The blood loss from your shoulder is increasing," she said, focusing on the immediate medical reality because it was the only aspect of this situation she felt qualified to handle. "You need surgical intervention within the next 30 minutes, or you risk permanent nerve damage and continued bleeding. Then I suggest you provide that intervention, Dr. Chun," Jang Hyunwoo said calmly. "Consider it the beginning of a more formal conversation about how your medical expertise might prove valuable to my organization." Amara felt the weight of impossible choices settling around her as she realized this moment would define everything that followed. She could refuse to treat him and maintain her ethical distance from his criminal enterprise, but that would likely doom Marcus to whatever fate awaited people who failed to honor their debts. Or she could provide the medical care he needed and acknowledge tacitly that her skills were now part of whatever arrangement he had in mind for resolving her brother's situation. "Your medical kit," Jang Hyunwoo said, nodding toward her emergency supplies. "Will it be sufficient for the procedure, or do you require additional equipment?" Amara looked at her hands, steady despite everything happening around her, then at the man who held her brother's life in his financial calculations. The decision had already been made, she realized. It had been made the moment Marcus signed documents he couldn't honor, creating a chain of consequences that had led inevitably to this warehouse and this choice. "I will need better lighting and sterile conditions," she said, her voice professional despite the fear coursing through her system. "This type of wound requires careful attention to prevent infection and ensure proper healing." Jang Hyunwoo's smile widened slightly, suggesting satisfaction with her response. "Excellent, Dr. Chun," he said. "I believe this is the beginning of a very productive professional relationship." 48 hours after the warehouse incident, Dr. Amara Chun was reviewing surgical notes in her office when her secretary announced an unexpected visitor. The man waiting in Metropolitan General's executive corridor bore no resemblance to the injured crime boss she had treated under emergency conditions. Jang Hyunwoo stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows wearing an impeccably tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people earned in 6 months, his dark hair perfectly styled, his sharp features composed in an expression of controlled authority that commanded immediate respect. "Dr. Chun," he said as she approached, his voice carrying the same quiet confidence she remembered from the warehouse. "I trust you have had time to consider our conversation from Friday evening." Amara unlocked her office door, acutely aware that every colleague and staff member in the corridor was observing this interaction with barely concealed curiosity. Jang Hyunwoo's presence radiated wealth and power in ways that made him impossible to ignore, from his Italian leather shoes to the subtle scent of expensive cologne that lingered in the air around him. "Please come in," she said, maintaining professional courtesy despite her racing pulse. "I assume you are here to discuss my brother's situation." "Among other matters," Jang Hyunwoo replied, settling into the chair across from her desk with fluid grace. "Your surgical skills under pressure were quite impressive, Dr. Chun. My shoulder is healing perfectly thanks to your intervention." Amara took her seat behind the mahogany desk that represented years of academic achievement and professional advancement. The familiar weight of medical textbooks and patient files surrounding her felt reassuring, a reminder of the legitimate world she had built through dedication and competence. But Jang Hyunwoo's presence transformed her sanctuary into neutral territory where different rules applied. "I provided emergency medical care as any physician would have done," she said carefully. "That does not create any ongoing obligation or relationship between us." Jang Hyunwoo smiled slightly, an expression that suggested amusement at her attempt to maintain professional distance. "Dr. Chun," he said, "your brother owes my organization exactly $2,437,000, including accumulated interest charges. The deadline for full payment is Monday at midnight, which gives us approximately 60 hours to resolve this matter." The specific figure hit Amara like a physical blow, somehow more devastating than the round number Marcus had mentioned earlier. The precision of Jang Hyunwoo's accounting made the debt feel impossibly concrete, a mathematical reality that could not be negotiated or explained away. "I have been investigating options for securing a loan of that magnitude," Amara said, though her voice lacked conviction even to her own ears. "Several financial institutions have expressed preliminary interest pending full application review." Jang Hyunwoo reached into his suit jacket and produced a leather portfolio that he placed on her desk with deliberate care. Inside were photographs and documents that made Amara's stomach clench with dread. Bank rejection letters bearing her name, credit reports showing her complete financial profile, and detailed assessments of her assets that totaled less than 1/10 of Marcus's debt. "Your net worth, including retirement accounts, property equity, and liquid assets, amounts to approximately $200,000, Jang Hyunwoo said with clinical precision. "No legitimate financial institution will provide unsecured lending of the magnitude required, particularly within our current time frame." Amara stared at the documents that laid out her financial life in stark detail, understanding that Jang Hyunwoo's organization had researched every aspect of her economic situation. The privacy violations represented by this information should have outraged her, but she was too focused on the mathematical impossibility of bridging the gap between what she could provide and what Marcus owed. "However," Jang Hyunwoo continued, "I am prepared to offer you an alternative arrangement that would resolve your brother's obligations while providing substantial compensation for your medical expertise." He opened a second folder containing documents printed on expensive letterhead that identified his organization as Jang Medical Consulting, a legitimate-sounding entity that could serve as cover for less conventional activities. The contract terms were laid out in precise legal language that made the offer sound almost like a traditional medical partnership agreement. "I require a personal physician with advanced surgical capabilities to provide exclusive medical services for my organization," Jang Hyunwoo explained. "This position would involve treating members of my business associates, maintaining complete confidentiality regarding all medical encounters, and residing in a secured medical facility that I will provide for your exclusive use." Amara read through the contract with growing amazement at the scope of what he was proposing. The financial terms alone were staggering. $500,000 annually, paid quarterly, plus full medical malpractice insurance, continuing education funding, and access to state-of-the-art equipment that surpassed what many hospitals could afford. "Your brother's debt would be considered satisfied upon execution of this agreement," Jang Hyunwoo added. "Additionally, his personal safety would be guaranteed for the duration of your employment, regardless of any future financial difficulties he might encounter." The offer was simultaneously generous and terrifying, providing financial security beyond anything Amara had imagined while binding her to an organization whose business practices she couldn't begin to understand. She studied the contract language carefully, noting that while the compensation was explicit, the specific duties remained deliberately vague. "What exactly would be required of me in this position?" she asked, setting the documents aside to meet Jiang Haian's steady gaze. "Medical treatment without questions regarding the circumstances that necessitated such treatment," he replied. "Absolute confidentiality regarding all patient encounters and organizational activities you might observe. Availability for emergency medical situations at any hour. Loyalty to the organization and discretion in all professional matters." Each requirement represented a violation of medical ethics, as Amara understood them. Treating patients without inquiring about illegal activities, maintaining silence about criminal behavior, providing medical support for an organization involved in violence and intimidation. The Hippocratic oath she had taken required her to do no harm, but participating in Jiang Haian's enterprise would make her complicit in activities that certainly caused harm to others. "I cannot ethically provide medical care while ignoring obvious signs of criminal activity," she said. "My professional obligations require me to report gunshot wounds, suspicious injuries, and evidence of violence to appropriate authorities." Jiang Hyunwoo nodded, as if he had expected this objection. "Dr. Chun," he said, "your ethical concerns are admirable but irrelevant to your current situation. Your brother will be killed Monday night if his debt remains unpaid. No amount of medical ethics will prevent that outcome or protect your family from the consequences of his poor decisions." The blunt statement forced Amara to confront the reality she had been avoiding since Marcus first revealed his gambling debts. Her moral principles meant nothing if she was dead, and her commitment to helping others was worthless if she couldn't save her own brother from the consequences of his mistakes. "You have 24 hours to make your decision," Jiang Hyunwoo continued, rising from his chair with the same fluid grace that marked all his movements. "After that time, Marcus's safety cannot be guaranteed regardless of any arrangements we might reach." Amara sat alone in her office for 2 hours after Jiang Hyunwoo departed, staring at the contract that represented the end of everything she had worked to become. The medical career she had built through years of sacrifice and dedication would be transformed into something unrecognizable, serving criminals instead of helping innocent patients. Her carefully constructed life of professional respect and ethical clarity would disappear into a world of moral compromise and dangerous obligations. But Marcus would live. Her brother, with all his flaws and poor judgment, would survive to make better choices and rebuild his life. The house their grandmother had left them would remain in their family instead of being seized to settle debts that could never be repaid through legitimate means. She thought about the photographs Jiang Hyunwoo had shown her, images of what happened to people who failed to honor their obligations to his organization. Marcus was weak and foolish, but he didn't deserve that kind of violence. And if she refused this offer, his death would accomplish nothing except satisfying Jiang Haian's business principles. The next morning, Amara called the number printed on Jiang Haian's business card. His assistant answered immediately, as if they had been waiting for her call. "Dr. Chun," the woman said in perfect English tinged with a Korean accent. "Mr. Jiang is available to meet with you at your convenience to finalize the arrangement." "I accept his offer," Amara said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was agreeing to undertake. "I will sign the contract and begin my new position immediately." "Excellent," the assistant replied. "A car will arrive at your residence this evening at 8 o'clock to transport you to your new medical facility. Please bring personal items sufficient for an extended stay, as your transition will begin tonight." Amara hung up the phone and sat quietly in her apartment, surrounded by the artifacts of her former life. Medical journals, surgical textbooks, awards, and certifications that documented her rise through the competitive world of cardiac surgery. In a few hours, all of this would become part of her past, replaced by a future she couldn't predict or control. But Marcus would live, and sometimes that was the only moral calculation that mattered. The medical facility Jiang Hyunwoo provided exceeded anything Amara had imagined possible outside of major university hospitals. Hidden within a compound of interconnected buildings in an exclusive district, the clinic occupied an entire floor designed specifically for trauma surgery and emergency medicine. The operating theater featured the latest surgical robotics, advanced imaging equipment, and monitoring systems that most medical centers couldn't afford. Every surface gleamed with sterile precision, from the titanium surgical tables to the climate-controlled storage areas for pharmaceuticals and blood products. Dr. Chun, welcome to your new practice, Jang Hyunwoo said as he guided her through the facility on her first evening. The equipment specifications were based on your published research preferences and the surgical protocols you developed during your residency at Massachusetts General. Amara moved through the clinic in amazement, recognizing instruments and technologies she had only dreamed of having access to during her hospital career. The cardiac monitoring systems were more sophisticated than those in most intensive care units, and the surgical suite included backup power systems and emergency protocols that suggested preparation for treating injuries under the most challenging circumstances. This must have cost millions to construct and equip, she said, running her fingers along the edge of a surgical table that represented the pinnacle of medical engineering. Money is not a limiting factor when investing in essential resources, Jang Hyunwoo replied. Your skills require appropriate tools to achieve optimal outcomes, and my people deserve the best medical care available. The first patient arrived 3 hours after Amara finished reviewing the clinic's equipment and protocols. A young Korean man in his early 20s, conscious but bleeding heavily from a knife wound that had penetrated his abdominal cavity. Two of Jang Hyunwoo's associates carried him into the emergency treatment area while speaking rapidly in Korean, their voices tight with concern and fear. Amara assessed the injury quickly, noting the location and depth of the wound while her hands automatically reached for the surgical instruments she would need. The patient's vital signs were stable but declining, indicating internal bleeding that required immediate intervention. She worked with practiced efficiency, establishing for access and preparing for emergency surgery while trying to ignore the obvious criminal context of how such an injury had occurred. "What is his name?" she asked, focusing on the medical reality rather than the circumstances that had created this emergency. "Lee Min-jun," one of the associates replied. "He is 23 years old, no known medical allergies, good physical condition before tonight's incident." Amara nodded, appreciating the relevant medical information while deliberately avoiding questions about what kind of incident had resulted in a precise knife wound to the abdomen. She began the surgical procedure with careful attention to repairing damaged tissues and controlling bleeding, falling into the familiar rhythm of emergency surgery that had sustained her through years of trauma medicine. Jang Hyunwoo appeared in the operating theater as she worked, observing her technique with the same intense focus she remembered from their first meeting at the warehouse. He wore surgical scrubs that made him look more like a medical colleague than a crime boss, but his presence still carried an authority that influenced everyone in the room. The injury missed major organs by approximately 2 centimeters, Amara reported as she continued working. Repair should be straightforward with minimal long-term complications if he follows proper recovery protocols. "Excellent," Jang Hyunwoo said quietly. "Min-jun is my nephew, Dr. Chun. His recovery is very important to me personally." The revelation that her patient was Jang Hyunwoo's family member added unexpected weight to the procedure, but Amara maintained her surgical focus while noting the obvious affection in his voice when he spoke about the young man. This was not the cold criminal mastermind she had expected, but someone capable of genuine concern for people under his protection. Over the following weeks, Amara treated a steady stream of patients with injuries that told the story of Jang Hyunwoo's organization without requiring explanation. Gunshot wounds that had been carefully cleaned and bandaged before arrival, suggesting immediate first aid provided by people with medical training. Broken bones that showed evidence of systematic violence but had been stabilized for transport. Drug overdoses treated with professional-grade naloxone administered by associates who understood emergency medical protocols. Each patient received the same careful attention to their families and recovery needs, with Jang Hyunwoo personally ensuring that medical expenses were covered and that injured associates received full pay during their rehabilitation. Amara watched him speak gently to frightened wives and children, arranging for temporary housing when injuries prevented family members from working, demonstrating a level of personal involvement that contradicted every stereotype she had held about criminal organizations. The moral boundaries that had seemed so clear during her hospital career began to blur as Amara recognized the human faces behind the violence. These were not anonymous criminals deserving whatever fate befell them, but people with families and relationships who had found themselves injured in service to something larger than themselves. Her role was not to judge their choices, but to provide medical care that might prevent minor injuries from becoming permanent disabilities or deaths. 1 month after beginning her new position, Amara received her first emergency call requiring immediate surgical intervention on Jang Hyunwoo himself. The phone rang at 2:30 in the morning, waking her from deep sleep in the apartment above the medical facility. Dr. Chun, this is Park Jin-ho from Mr. Jang's security detail, the voice said with barely controlled urgency. We are bringing him to you immediately with a serious knife wound to his upper torso. Estimated arrival in 8 minutes. Amara was fully awake and moving toward the surgical suite before the call ended, her hands automatically reaching for the equipment she would need to treat a chest wound. The clinic's emergency lighting activated as she prepared the operating theater, and she could hear vehicles approaching the compound with the kind of speed that suggested genuine crisis. They carried Jang Hyunwoo into the treatment area with blood soaking through his shirt and his face pale from blood loss. The knife wound extended from his left shoulder toward his chest, deep enough to require careful exploration to assess damage to underlying structures. His eyes found hers immediately as they transferred him to the surgical table, and she saw something unexpected in his expression, complete trust in her abilities despite his obvious pain. How deep does the wound extend? He asked, his voice steady despite the severity of his injury. I need to examine the extent of tissue damage before making that assessment, Amara replied, her hands already working to remove his shirt and expose the full length of the laceration. This will require surgery to repair properly and prevent infection. Then I am fortunate to have access to such skilled medical care, Jang Hyunwoo said, and she could hear genuine appreciation rather than mere politeness in his tone. The surgical procedure required 3 hours of careful work to repair severed muscles and ensure that no internal organs had been compromised by the attack. Amara found herself more invested in achieving perfect results than she had been with any patient since beginning this position, driven by concern that went beyond professional obligation into something more personal. As she worked, she became aware of Jang Hyunwoo's physical presence in ways that had nothing to do with medical assessment. His body was lean and powerful beneath her surgical instruments, marked with old scars that suggested previous injuries sustained through years of dangerous work. The controlled way he managed pain without complaint spoke to a toughness that was both impressive and concerning, indicating someone accustomed to violence and its consequences. The knife missed your lung by less than an inch, she said as she completed the final sutures. Another 2 centimeters, and this would have been a life-threatening injury requiring emergency surgery at a trauma center. But it was not 2 centimeters deeper, Jang Hyunwoo replied, his dark eyes studying her face as she worked. And I have access to surgical care that exceeds what most trauma centers could provide. I consider myself very fortunate, Dr. Chun. The way he spoke her name, with careful attention to each syllable, made something shift in the air between them. Amara became suddenly aware that they were alone in the operating theater, that her hands were still touching his skin as she completed her examination of the surgical site, that the professional distance she had been maintaining was dissolving into something more complicated. You should rest for at least 48 hours to allow the initial healing to stabilize, she said, stepping back from the surgical table to create physical space between them. No strenuous activity until I can assess how well the tissue repair is progressing. I will follow your medical recommendations precisely, Dr. Chun, Jang Hyunwoo said, sitting up slowly on the surgical table. Your expertise has become very important to me, both professionally and personally. The quiet intensity of his words created a moment of awareness that transformed their interaction from medical consultation to something approaching intimacy. Amara found herself studying his face, noting the sharp intelligence in his dark eyes and the controlled strength that marked his every movement. This was a dangerous man who could command fear and respect from subordinates throughout the city, but he was also someone who trusted her completely with his physical vulnerability. I should change these dressings daily to monitor for signs of infection, she said, focusing on practical medical concerns to avoid thinking about the implications of spending more time in close physical proximity to Jang Hyunwoo. Then I look forward to receiving your continued medical attention, he replied, and the slight smile that accompanied his words suggested he was as aware as she was of the tension developing between them. Over the next week, as Amara monitored Jiang Haiyan's recovery and changed his surgical dressings, she found herself anticipating their daily appointments with an intensity that had nothing to do with medical necessity. Their conversations during these sessions ranged from discussions of his organization's business strategies to observations about art and literature that revealed an unexpected intellectual sophistication. He was widely read, thoughtful about political and economic developments, and capable of engaging with complex ideas in ways that challenged her assumptions about criminal leaders. The careful boundaries between doctor and patient, between legitimate medicine and criminal enterprise, between professional obligation and personal attraction, were dissolving into something neither of them could control or deny. Amara was beginning to understand that her descent into Jiang Haiyan's world was not just about treating injured associates or earning money to save her brother's life. She was falling for the man who had orchestrated her transformation from respected surgeon to complicit participant in activities she couldn't defend, and that realization was more dangerous than any of the medical emergencies she had been trained to handle. The emergency call that changed everything came at 11:43 on a Thursday night, delivered by Park Jin-ho with a desperation Amara had never heard in his voice before. "Dr. Chun," he said, his words rapid and strained, "Mr. Jiang has been shot multiple times. We are bringing him to you immediately, but he has lost significant blood and his condition is critical." Amara was moving toward the surgical suite before the call ended, her hands automatically reaching for the equipment she would need to treat multiple gunshot wounds. The clinic's emergency lighting bathed everything in stark white illumination as she prepared for what sounded like the most serious medical crisis since beginning her work with Jiang Haiyan's organization. Her pulse hammered with professional urgency, mixed with something more personal that she didn't want to examine too closely. They carried Jiang Hyunwoo into the treatment area unconscious and pale from blood loss, his expensive suit torn and soaked with blood from wounds to his chest and abdomen. Amara performed her initial assessment with practiced efficiency, noting entrance wounds that suggested close-range gunfire from multiple directions. His breathing was shallow and irregular, indicating possible lung involvement, and his blood pressure readings confirmed significant internal bleeding requiring immediate surgical intervention. "How long has he been unconscious?" she asked, establishing for access while her hands moved through emergency protocols with automatic precision. "Approximately 8 minutes, Park Jin-ho replied, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. The attack happened during a meeting with rival organization representatives. Multiple shooters, close range, obviously planned assassination attempt." Amara nodded without looking up from her patient, focusing entirely on the medical realities that would determine whether Jiang Hyunwoo survived the next few hours. The bullets had created a complex pattern of internal damage requiring careful exploration to identify and repair all compromised organs and blood vessels. This was the kind of trauma surgery that demanded every skill she had developed during years of emergency medicine training. The operation lasted 6 hours and required 3 separate procedures to address the full extent of Jiang Haiyan's injuries. Amara worked with intense concentration, repairing a punctured lung, removing bullet fragments from his liver, and controlling bleeding from multiple arterial injuries. Her surgical technique had never been more precise or focused, driven by determination that went far beyond professional obligation into something approaching desperation. As dawn light filtered through the clinic windows, Amara finally completed the last sutures and stepped back from the surgical table where Jiang Hyunwoo lay connected to multiple monitoring devices and 4 lines. His vital signs had stabilized during the final hour of surgery, but his condition remained critical. The next 24 hours would determine whether her surgical repairs would hold and whether any complications would develop from the extensive trauma his body had sustained. The recovery period tested every aspect of Amara's medical training and emotional resilience. Jiang Hyunwoo developed a high fever that lasted for 3 days, causing periods of delirium during which he spoke in rapid Korean and seemed unaware of his surroundings. Amara maintained a constant vigil beside his bed, monitoring his condition and adjusting medications to prevent infection while fighting the complications that threatened to undo her surgical work. During his delirious episodes, Jang Hyunwoo called her name repeatedly, his voice strained with fever and pain as his subconscious mind reached for something familiar and safe. Amara found herself holding his hand during the worst periods, speaking in quiet, reassuring tones to calm his agitation. The professional distance she had maintained throughout their previous interactions dissolved completely as she watched him struggle against the effects of trauma and medication. On the morning of the fourth day, Jang Hyunwoo's fever finally broke and his eyes opened with clear awareness for the first time since the surgery. His gaze found Amara immediately where she sat in a chair beside his bed, her hair disheveled from 3 nights of interrupted sleep and her scrubs wrinkled from maintaining her bedside vigil. "Dr. Chun," he said, his voice hoarse but strong enough to indicate significant improvement in his condition. "You look exhausted. How long have I been unconscious?" 3.5 days, she replied, checking his pupil responses and noting the return of normal neurological function. "You sustained multiple gunshot wounds requiring extensive surgery. Your recovery has been complicated by fever and infection, but your vital signs are now stable." Jang Hyunwoo attempted to sit up, but winced as the movement pulled against his surgical repairs. Amara immediately moved to adjust his position, her hands gentle but firm as she helped him find a comfortable angle that wouldn't stress his healing tissues. The physical contact sent awareness through both of them, a reminder of the intimacy that had developed during their weeks of medical consultations. "I owe you my life, Dr. Chun," Jang Hyunwoo said quietly, his dark eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Without your surgical skill and dedication to my recovery, I would not have survived this assassination attempt. You would have received the same quality of care at any major trauma center," Amara replied, though her voice lacked conviction as she spoke the professional disclaimer. "No," Jang Hyunwoo said, his gaze never leaving her face. "No other surgeon would have maintained a bedside vigil for 3 days, monitoring my condition personally instead of delegating care to nursing staff. No other doctor would have been motivated by anything beyond professional obligation to ensure my recovery." The quiet intensity of his words created a moment of awareness that made Amara suddenly conscious of how deeply invested she had become in his well-being. Her concern for his survival had exceeded anything she had experienced with previous patients, driven by emotions she was reluctant to examine or acknowledge. "There is something I must tell you, Dr. Chun," Jang Hyunwoo continued, his expression growing serious in ways that suggested difficult revelations. "Something about the circumstances that brought you into my organization that you deserve to understand completely." Amara felt a cold dread settling in her stomach as she recognized the tone of someone preparing to confess something significant. She remained silent, waiting for him to continue while dreading whatever truth he was about to reveal. "Your brother's gambling debts were not entirely accidental," Jang Hyunwoo said carefully. "My associates identified you as someone whose medical skills could prove valuable to our organization, and Marcus was encouraged to participate in games where the stakes would eventually exceed his ability to pay." The words hit Amara like a physical blow as she processed what he was telling her. Marcus's financial crisis, the impossible debt that had forced her to compromise her medical ethics, the entire chain of events that had brought her into Jang Hyunwoo's world had been orchestrated deliberately to acquire her services. "You manipulated my brother into gambling beyond his means," she said, her voice rising with anger and hurt as the full implications became clear. "You destroyed his financial stability and threatened his life to force me into working for your organization. Your medical expertise was essential to my operations," Jang Hyunwoo replied without apology. "Traditional recruitment methods would not have been sufficient to convince someone of your professional standing to provide services to an organization like mine." Amara stood abruptly from her chair, her hands shaking with rage as she fully understood how completely she had been manipulated. The careful moral justifications she had constructed around accepting his offer, the belief that she was choosing the lesser evil to protect her family, all of it had been based on a deception designed to trap her in circumstances she would never have accepted voluntarily. "I trusted you," she said, her voice breaking with the magnitude of his betrayal. "I compromised every ethical principle I had been trained to uphold because I believed you were offering a legitimate solution to an impossible situation. The arrangement has been mutually beneficial, Jang Hyunwoo said, attempting to sit up further despite his injuries. Your medical skills have saved lives, including my own, and your brother's safety has been guaranteed regardless of any future poor decisions he might make. Amara turned toward the door, no longer able to remain in the same room with someone who had orchestrated such an elaborate deception. The weeks of growing attraction and emotional connection now felt like additional layers of manipulation designed to ensure her compliance with his plans. Dr. Chun, Jang Hyunwoo called after her, his voice carrying a note of urgency that made her pause at the threshold. Do not leave while we are in the middle of this conversation. There is nothing more to discuss, she replied without turning around. I fulfilled my obligations by saving your life. Consider your debt to me paid in full. Jang Hyunwoo moved faster than someone recovering from major surgery should have been able to manage, crossing the room in several quick strides that brought him directly behind Amara as she reached for the door handle. His hand closed over hers, preventing her from leaving while his presence overwhelming her senses with the familiar scent of his cologne mixed with antiseptic and healing skin. You cannot walk away from this, he said, his voice low and intense with emotions she had never heard from him before. What has developed between us extends far beyond any business arrangement or professional obligation. There is nothing between us except deception and manipulation, Amara replied, trying to pull away from his grip while fighting the awareness that his proximity created despite her anger. Jang Hyunwoo turned her to face him, his hands framing her face with surprising gentleness given the intensity burning in his dark eyes. The 3 days you spent caring for me, the way you held my hand during the worst of the fever, the concern in your voice when my condition was critical. None of that was professional obligation, Dr. Chun. The truth of his words cut through her anger because she could not deny the depth of her emotional investment in his recovery. But acknowledging her feelings meant accepting that her attraction to him had developed despite knowing who he was and what he represented, which made her complicit in ways that extended beyond medical care. I cannot stay knowing that everything between us was built on lies, she said, her voice barely above a whisper as she struggled against the pull of his magnetic presence. Then let me show you something that is not a lie, Jang Hyunwoo said, and before she could respond, he lowered his head and captured her mouth in a kiss that shattered every remaining barrier between them. The kiss was desperate and claiming, months of suppressed attraction and emotional tension exploding into physical contact that neither of them could control or deny. Amara's hands fisted in his shirt as she kissed him back with equal intensity, all rational thought disappearing into the overwhelming sensation of finally acknowledging what had been building between them since their first meeting. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Jang Hyunwoo's eyes burned with possessive intensity that transformed his entire expression. You are mine now, Dr. Chun, he said, his voice rough with emotion and determination. No more pretending this is just business between us. I am not yours, Amara replied, though her voice lacked conviction as she remained within the circle of his arms. Yes, you are, Jang Hyunwoo said with quiet certainty. You have been mine since the moment you agreed to save my life, and that kiss just made it official. You will become my wife within the week, and there will be no further discussion about leaving or maintaining professional distance. The possessive declaration should have terrified her, but instead Amara felt something deeper than fear settling into her bones. This was the moment when all pretense finally fell away, when the careful boundaries she had maintained dissolved into the truth of what had been inevitable since their first meeting. She belonged to him now, and despite everything he had done to engineer this outcome, she could no longer imagine wanting to be anywhere else. The wedding preparations began immediately, transforming Jang Hyunwoo's estate into something between a fortress and a palace as traditional Korean ceremonies merged with legal requirements that would bind Amara to him permanently. She watched the elaborate arrangements unfold with a mixture of amazement and resignation, understanding that this was not a celebration she could influence or escape, but a formal claiming that would reshape her identity completely. Traditional Korean wedding attire arrived from seamstresses who had crafted garments for generations of wealthy families, silk and embroidery that cost more than most people earned in years. The hanbok designed specifically for Amara featured intricate patterns in deep crimson and gold, colors that symbolized prosperity and happiness, while marking her transformation from independent surgeon to the wife of Korea's most powerful crime boss. Dr. Chun, Jang Hyunwoo said as she examined the elaborate garments spread across her apartment above the medical facility. You understand that this ceremony will be legally binding in multiple jurisdictions and will establish you as my wife in all official capacities. I understand that I have no choice in the matter, Amara replied, running her fingers along silk so fine it felt like touching liquid luxury. You have made it clear that refusal is not an option you are prepared to accept. Choice and acceptance are different concepts entirely, Jang Hyunwoo said, moving closer until his presence dominated her awareness despite her attempts to maintain emotional distance. I want you to choose this marriage, Dr. Chun, not simply accept it as an inevitable consequence of circumstances. Amara looked up from the wedding attire to meet his dark eyes, seeing something vulnerable beneath the controlled authority that had defined all their previous interactions. The man who could command fear and respect from criminal associates throughout the city was asking for her willing participation in something that mattered to him beyond business arrangements or sexual attraction. Why does my choice matter to you? She asked, genuinely curious about motivations that seemed inconsistent with everything she understood about his character. You have demonstrated repeatedly that you are capable of compelling cooperation through manipulation and force when necessary. Jang Hyunwoo was quiet for several moments, his expression growing thoughtful in ways she had rarely observed during their professional relationship. When he spoke, his voice carried emotions she had never heard from him before, raw honesty that suggested he was revealing something deeply personal. My family was destroyed by medical negligence when I was 15 years old, he said, settling into the chair across from where she stood examining the wedding clothes. My mother developed complications during what should have been routine surgery, and the hospital assigned her care to physicians who were more concerned with their own convenience than her survival. Amara felt her professional instincts engage as she recognized the pain of someone who had lost family members to medical mistakes. She had seen that particular combination of grief and anger many times during her hospital career, usually directed at healthcare systems that failed people during their most vulnerable moments. The surgeon was intoxicated during the operation, Jang Hyunwoo continued, his hands clenched as he recounted memories that obviously still caused him significant distress. The anesthesiologist was handling multiple procedures simultaneously and failed to monitor her condition properly. When complications developed, no one with appropriate expertise was available to provide emergency intervention. How old were you when this happened? Amara asked, setting aside the silk garments to focus entirely on his story. 15, with a younger sister who was only 12, Jang Hyunwoo said. We became orphans because medical professionals treated our mother's life as less important than their own schedules and personal comfort. The hospital administration offered financial settlements and legal protections, but no one was held accountable for the negligence that killed her. Amara understood now why her medical competence and dedication had impressed him so profoundly from their first meeting. She represented everything he had needed during his family's crisis. A physician who would prioritize patient welfare over personal convenience and who possessed the skills necessary to handle emergency situations with precision and care. Having access to a doctor I can trust completely, someone whose medical judgment and dedication I never need to question, means more to me than you can possibly understand, Jang Hyunwoo said. But I want that physician to be my wife because she chooses to share my life, not because circumstances have trapped her in arrangements she cannot escape. The vulnerability in his confession transformed Amara's understanding of their entire relationship, revealing motivations that extended far beyond sexual attraction or business convenience into deeply personal needs rooted in childhood trauma. His possessive behavior and elaborate planning to acquire her services suddenly seemed less like criminal manipulation and more like desperate attempts to prevent experiencing again the helplessness he had felt during his mother's medical crisis. I choose this marriage, Amara said quietly, her words carrying conviction that surprised her with their sincerity. Not because I have no alternatives, but because I have come to understand who you are and what you represent in ways that extend beyond the circumstances that brought us together. Jang Hyunwoo's expression shifted dramatically as he processed her statement, relief and satisfaction replacing the vulnerability that had marked his confession. He stood and moved toward her with the fluid grace that characterized all his movements, stopping close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. Then when you speak your wedding vows tomorrow, they will represent genuine commitment rather than resignation to inevitable circumstances, he said, his voice low and intense with emotions that made her pulse quicken with anticipation. The wedding ceremony itself combined traditional Korean elements with legal requirements that would establish their marriage in multiple jurisdictions, ensuring that no technicality could undermine the legitimacy of their union. Amara spoke her vows in Korean phrases she had practiced phonetically, promising loyalty and partnership to a man whose world she was only beginning to understand. Jang Hyunwoo's responses were delivered in perfect English, his deep voice carrying conviction that transformed legal formalities into something approaching poetry. The wedding night revealed aspects of Jang Hyunwoo's character that his public persona had never suggested, tenderness and consideration that replaced the controlled authority she had observed during their professional interactions. He approached their physical intimacy with the same careful attention he devoted to business planning, ensuring her comfort and pleasure with patience that demonstrated genuine concern for her emotional well-being. "You are beautiful, Dr. Jang," he murmured against her skin as they lay together afterward, using her married name for the first time with obvious satisfaction. "More beautiful than I had imagined during all the weeks I watched you work in the medical facility." "Dr. Jang," Amara repeated thoughtfully, testing how her new identity sounded when spoken aloud. "I suppose my former life as Dr. Chun ended officially when I signed those marriage documents." "Your professional expertise remains unchanged," Jang Hyunwoo said, his arms tightening around her as they settled into the intimacy of shared sleep. "You are still the finest cardiac surgeon in the city, but now your skills serve our family's interests rather than a hospital administration that never fully appreciated your capabilities." The peaceful domesticity of their early marriage lasted exactly 6 weeks before external threats reminded Amara that becoming Jang Hyunwoo's wife had made her a target for anyone seeking to damage his organization. The first warning came through intercepted communications indicating that rival families viewed his marriage as a potential weakness that could be exploited through violence or kidnapping. "They see you as my vulnerability," Jang Hyunwoo explained during an emergency security briefing conducted in his private office. "Intelligence suggests that multiple organizations are planning operations designed to capture or harm you as a method of gaining leverage over our business activities. Then we will need to adjust my security protocols and limit my exposure to public settings," Amara replied, approaching the threat assessment with the same practical mindset she applied to medical emergencies. "No," Jang Hyunwoo said firmly, his expression hardening with determination that brooked no argument. "You will not become a prisoner in your own home because other people have chosen to threaten our family. We will eliminate the source of these threats permanently rather than allowing them to dictate how we conduct our lives." Amara recognized the cold resolve that had built his criminal empire, the willingness to use overwhelming force rather than accepting limitations imposed by others. But she also understood that maintaining her medical practice required some degree of public accessibility that would always create security vulnerabilities regardless of protective measures. "I refuse to abandon my work at the trauma center," she said, referring to her twice-weekly volunteer shifts at a public hospital that served the city's most underserved populations. "Those patients depend on surgical expertise that no one else is providing, and I will not allow criminal politics to prevent me from fulfilling that obligation. Your safety is more important than any volunteer medical work," Jang Hyunwoo said, though his tone suggested he recognized the futility of trying to convince her to abandon her humanitarian commitments. The test of their marriage came 3 weeks later when Amara's predicted vulnerability became reality during what should have been a routine morning at the trauma center. She was reviewing patient charts when armed men entered the hospital through service corridors that bypassed normal security screening. The kidnapping was executed with professional efficiency that suggested careful planning and detailed knowledge of her schedule and routines. Dr. Jang, the leader of the kidnapping team, said as they secured her in the back of an unmarked van, "You are now a guest of the Choi family organization. Your husband's recent interference in our business operations requires correction, and you will provide the motivation necessary for his cooperation. The Choi family had operated in direct competition with Jang Hyenwa's organization for several years, maintaining an uneasy territorial balance that had recently shifted due to expansion of legitimate business ventures that threatened their traditional revenue sources. Kidnapping the wife of their primary rival represented an escalation that would demand decisive response regardless of potential consequences. Amara was held in a warehouse facility designed specifically for interrogation and intimidation, though her captors treated her with careful respect that indicated understanding of her value as a negotiating asset rather than a target for personal violence. They provided medical journals to occupy her time and ensured her physical comfort while they conducted negotiations with Jang Hyenwa's representatives. Dr. Jang, the Choi family's negotiator, said during her second day of captivity, "Your husband has refused all reasonable compromise proposals and has instead chosen to escalate this conflict through unproductive threats. Perhaps you could encourage him toward more cooperative approaches to resolving our business disagreements." "I will not provide information about my husband's business operations or serve as an intermediary in your negotiations," Amara replied with calm professionalism. "My medical training requires maintaining strict confidentiality regarding all patient information and organizational activities I may have observed." The kidnapping lasted exactly 62 hours before Jang Hyenwa's response demonstrated why rival organizations had previously avoided direct confrontation with his enterprise. The rescue operation was conducted with military precision that left no survivors among her captors and eliminated the Choi family's leadership structure permanently. Amara heard the gunfire approaching through the warehouse corridors before the door to her confinement area burst open to reveal her husband accompanied by heavily armed associates. "Dr. Jang," Jang Hyunwoo said, his voice tight with emotions that mixed relief with barely controlled rage, "are you injured or harmed in any way that requires immediate medical attention?" "I am uninjured," Amara replied, rising from the chair where she had been reading medical literature while waiting for resolution. "They treated me with considerable care and respect throughout the entire situation." The drive back to their estate was conducted in silence that reflected Jang Hyenwa's struggle to process the terror he had experienced during her disappearance. Amara watched his profile as he stared out the car windows, noting the tension in his jaw and the rigid control he maintained over emotions that obviously threatened to overwhelm his usual composure. "You were afraid," she said quietly, reaching over to take his hand in hers with gentle pressure that offered comfort and connection. "I was terrified," Jang Hyunwoo admitted, his fingers interlacing with hers as he finally looked at her directly. "The possibility of losing you to violence or negligence was intolerable in ways I had not anticipated when we married. You have become essential to my emotional stability in addition to your medical value to our organization." The confession revealed depths of attachment that transformed Amara's understanding of their marriage from business arrangement enhanced by sexual attraction into something approaching genuine partnership. She had become important to him as a person, not just as a skilled professional whose services he had acquired through elaborate manipulation. "I am not leaving," she said, her voice carrying conviction that surprised her with its certainty. "Not because I cannot find alternatives or because circumstances prevent other choices, but because this is where I belong now. With you, in this life we have built together." 6 months later, Amara demonstrated the extent of her commitment to their partnership when she volunteered to provide emergency surgery for the young daughter of a rival crime boss whose previous conflicts with Jang Hyunwoo had resulted in significant violence and territorial disputes. The child required complex cardiac surgery that no other physician in the city possessed the expertise to perform successfully. She is 8 years old with a congenital heart defect that will prove fatal without immediate surgical intervention, Amara explained to her husband as she prepared to leave for the rival organization's medical facility. "This is not about politics or business relationships, but about saving a child's life. Treating the daughter of our enemies will be interpreted as weakness by other organizations," Jang Hyunwoo said, though his expression suggested he understood and respected her motivations. "They will view medical compassion as an opportunity to exploit our humanitarian instincts. Then they will be mistaken," Amara replied, checking her surgical instruments one final time before departing. Mercy is not weakness when it comes from a position of strength, and saving that child's life will demonstrate that our power extends beyond the ability to destroy into the capacity to preserve what is valuable and innocent. The surgery required 8 hours of delicate work to repair complex cardiac abnormalities that had threatened the child's survival since birth. Amara operated with precision that reflected years of advanced training, supported by Jang Hyunwoo, who remained at her side throughout the procedure despite the obvious security risks of entering rival territory for humanitarian purposes. 1 year after their marriage, Dr. Amara Jang operated as chief of surgery at the newly constructed Seoul Metropolitan Trauma Center, a state-of-the-art medical facility funded entirely through her husband's legitimate business enterprises. The hospital served the city's most underserved populations while providing advanced trauma care that rivaled any facility in Asia. Jang Hyunwoo had transformed portions of his criminal empire into legal medical investments, creating sustainable funding sources for humanitarian work that satisfied Amara's professional obligations while advancing their shared interests. The operating theater where they worked together combined the best elements of their respective expertise, her surgical skill enhanced by his strategic planning and resource management. They moved through complex procedures with synchronized precision that reflected months of collaborative practice, saving lives that would have been lost without their partnership. Dr. Jang, her surgical resident, said as they completed a particularly challenging cardiac procedure, "Your technique during that valve replacement was absolutely flawless. The patient's prognosis is excellent thanks to your surgical expertise." "Thank you, Dr. Kim," Amara replied, noting her husband's slight smile as he observed her interaction with medical students who obviously held her in tremendous professional respect. Excellence in surgery requires continuous learning and dedication to improving patient outcomes regardless of external circumstances. As they left the operating theater together, wedding rings catching the surgical lights, Amara reflected on the transformation that had brought her from reluctant participant in a criminal organization to willing partner in an enterprise that balanced legitimate medical service with the darker necessities of protecting their family and business interests. She had found her place in Jang Hyunwoo's world not through resignation to circumstances she couldn't control, but through genuine choice to build something meaningful with a man whose complexity had surprised and captivated her completely. "You are mine, Dr. Jang," Jang Hyunwoo said quietly as they walked through corridors of the medical facility they had created together. "And you are mine," she replied, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had discovered that love could flourish even in the most unexpected circumstances. "Forever and always."